Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents Good News Today, featuring an inspiring gospel teaching by Father Jim Willig.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. A leper came to Jesus and, kneeling down, begged him and said, "If you wish, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said to him, "I do will it. Be made clean." The leprosy left him immediately, and he was made clean. Then, warning him sternly, he dismissed him at once. He said to him, "See that you tell no one anything, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses prescribed. That will be proof for them." The man went away and began to publicize the whole matter. He spread the report abroad so that it was impossible for Jesus to enter a town openly. He remained outside in deserted places, and people kept coming to him from everywhere. The Gospel of the Lord.
Recently, a woman approached me and inquired, why is it that when we read so much and so often in the gospel where Jesus heals all the sick, why is it that the church or you never heal anybody? Oh, okay, I said, well, I guess it should be obvious. There's just a big difference between Jesus and me. I thought I was off the hook, but she didn't let up so easily. She said, yeah, but didn't he instruct and empower his disciples to continue his healing ministry? And I was uncharacteristically silent. I didn't know what to say. What would you say? Keep that question in mind as we study this wonderful miracle story of the healing of the leper. This remarkable miracle becomes even more powerful if we were to take a moment, as I wish to do now, to understand some of the background, some of the social context of this dreaded disease of leprosy back in the time of Christ. First, just a word about what scholars suggest today is that this leprosy that's noted in the gospel, they presume is not the Hansen's disease that we know to be today. But it was just as much an awful kind of skin disease or even possibly cancer that disfigured a person in some way and left them feeling completely ostracized. Our ancestors of faith, we might know, believed that any imperfections was contradictory to true holiness, which is to say, that they understood holiness not only to be a spiritual condition, but also a physical wholeness. And therefore, in the book of Leviticus, we can read the fourth book of the Bible that talks a lot about religious or ritual purity. It states that any kind of skin blemish makes a person, quote, ritually unclean, unquote. And Leviticus ordered such a person who would have what we can now call biblical leprosy, that is, any blemish on a person's body, to, quote, they ordered them to live alone and have their dwelling place outside of the camp. It's almost impossible for us here today to appreciate fully the impact of this judgment. In Mediterranean cultures, the family and community meant everything. If someone was ostracized or literally excommunicated from the community, it would be the kiss of death. They would lose not only contact with their family and friends, but they lose access to their source of life, their source of sustenance. The entire economy was based on its interconnectedness. In other words, such a person would often die in such a seclusion. It would be like a fish out of water. Moreover, the book of Leviticus stipulated that any such person with leprosy needed to avoid any kind of contact with any other person in the community, so much so that as they were walking down the street and they would meet someone even 20 yards away, they would need to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," so that they would not pollute that person. That was the awful mentality of that leprosy back then and there. And so as we look to the gospel then, it truly is amazing that this particular man, scarred with the dreaded disease of leprosy, dares to ignore this religious restriction, and he cries out for healing. He breaks through that distance that kept him from community to come to Christ. And in the most dramatic way, he falls down on his knees. What a beautiful posture of humility and sincerity by which he cries out with tremendous faith, "Lord, if you will to do so, you can cure me." What tremendous faith is stated in that simple phrase. If you will to do so, you can cure me. We're told Jesus was moved with pity and stretched out his hand, touched him, and said, "I do will it. Be cured." The leprosy left him then and there, and he was cured. As we look at that very loaded sentence and statement, first, that Jesus was moved with pity. He was moved by this terrible sense of separation that his poor man, who through no sin of his own, yet the implication was he brought it on himself. That was the mentality back then. Jesus knew how wrong that was. And so Jesus crosses over that barrier of fear. He crosses over that barrier of separation, and he literally got in touch with the man. He said to him, "I do will it, be cured." You can hear Christ crying out with everything in him how the Lord hates to see suffering. It assures us of Jesus' tremendous compassion, and it's that compassion, that oneness with those suffering, that made him want to heal people. But more important than the words of Jesus is his very action that speaks louder than words. He stretched out his hand and touched him. Don't miss this obvious point. The lepers were the untouchables, the unlovable people of the day of Christ. And Jesus crossed to the other side to be in solidarity with the man, to join in his community of outcast people, to be one with him. He literally and completely came in touch with him. And with that source of sickness that was more than the man, it was in all of the society. And he overcame it with the power of his healing love. If we understand that marvelous action of Jesus, maybe we can begin to answer the question the woman asked of me: why don't we heal people? How can we carry on this ministry of loving, accepting people who find themselves ostracized or alienated in some way? For our reflection of this gospel, I thought I would share a story of a young man who I think resembles to me more than anyone I've ever met, this man with leprosy. Some years ago, when I was at St. George Parish, I met Tim. Tim was in his young 30s and had recently learned that he had contracted the dreaded disease of AIDS. And I remembered even then, meeting him, that I thought there probably is no other equivalent today closer to the disease of leprosy of yesterday than AIDS, that has so many moral connotations and a sense of alienation, a sense of fear that's provoked from the contagion of the disease, and oftentimes leaves people feeling so isolated. And in fact, that was the case with Tim. His family had rejected him years ago because of his homosexual orientation. He also felt that same kind of alienation from the church for much the same reason. And now that he had learned he had AIDS, he was terrified when he was first brought to the hospital with pneumonia, which left him in a critical condition, for he had no immunity to fight off sickness. And he described for me the time that he was lying in bed, shivering with cold, staring at death, which was knocking at the door, and not knowing what in the world to do or to whom he could turn. He desperately looked up to the heaven and cried the most sincere prayer for Jesus to come and save him. Tim mentioned that he hadn't prayed for what seemed years. He'd almost felt he had lost his faith, just as he had seemed to lose so much faith in others and in himself. But now, crying out to Jesus at this desperate time, he said he immediately felt a certain presence enter the room. It wasn't any person, it wasn't anything physical, but a spiritual presence and peace that came over him, as he described, like a blanket that immediately set his shivering body at rest. And something settled deep inside of him, like he knew there was a spiritual power entering into him. And then he heard the clear voice speak inside of him, which he immediately recognized to be Jesus, whom he had just cried out to, say to him, "Tim, come back to me. Come back to the church." And just as Jesus had said to the leper, when Jesus reached out to touch him, "And go see a priest." Tim made an incredibly quick recovery and was released from the hospital. And a day later, went immediately from the hospital to St. George Parish, which was, as maybe you know, just a few blocks away. And I was so blessed to be at the door when he arrived. Now, mind you, he hadn't been to church, much less a rectory, for maybe 20-some years. And he came in to my office, sat down, and told me this powerful story of how Jesus reached out to him, touched him with his love. Now, I wish I could say that Tim was physically healed, but he was not. Happier to say he was spiritually healed and made whole. And in such a dramatic way, Tim became a faithful parishioner. More than that, he went on to speak to many other people who also were HIV infected and spoke of the serenity the Spirit of God alone can offer and help of God's people. Tim suffered a very hard death. I remember he first, as I would visit him again and again, became quite emaciated, almost like a skeleton, and then went blind, and then lost his mental faculties, and then expired. And I remember feeling all the while he was losing his body, he was gaining a new life. I had this sense of that presence of Jesus that stayed with him through it all. And I'll never forget celebrating his Mass of Resurrection at St. George Church where he returned. And saying with some confidence that now Jesus had completed his healing and had given him a whole new life. As I am reminded of Tim, as I read this Gospel of the Leper, perhaps you might be reminded of some people in maybe a less dramatic way or suffering a less obvious sickness. But even within ourselves, I suspect there is a certain part of all of our life, something deep inside of us that we might not even be in touch with ourselves, that we might consider unclean, that we might consider impure, unfair, or the ugly side of our personality. And I wonder if that isn't the very part of us that needs to be healed, be brought before the Lord, and that person in us needs to cry out for Jesus to love it to death. And those among our family, you know how we're all blessed with that certain strange person or estranged person among our relations? Maybe it's to that person that really, in their bizarre behavior, is a strange way of crying out for our love, for our acceptance, for our healing. And this gospel would urge us to get in touch with that person. And what about ourselves? How are we being challenged to put ourselves out, to sacrifice ourselves, to be with people who are hurting and needing our loving attention? Maybe the woman was right to ask me, why aren't you able to heal? How Jesus can use us if we are willing to get in touch with that wounded side of the body of Christ. If we are willing to be in touch with our own pain, perhaps, that unites us with the struggle of others, and to allow the Lord to work his miracle among us. That's something to think about. My question is, how can this gospel we have just read happen again today? Through us and among us. Amen.
Heart to Heart welcomes you back next week for another inspiring edition of Good News Today. If you are interested in other books, CDs, DVDs, or digital downloads by Father Jim or Father Michael, you can call toll-free 1-877-208-4875 or visit our website www.heartoheart.org. There, you can also sign up to receive a weekly reminder to listen to these same programs online. And please, consider a donation of any size to help support Heart to Heart's radio and internet ministry. That's www.heartoheart.org or call 1-877-208-4875. Thank you for listening, and may God bless your heart and the hearts of all of your loved ones.
Heart to Heart.